The $2 bride. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip across the suffocating saloon. Do I hear $2 for the widow and her 5 brats? Laughter erupted, cruel, sharp-edged laughter that cut deeper than any blade. Evelyn Hart stood on that splintered platform, her youngest daughter burning with fever in her arms, and felt the weight of every judging eye. The August heat pressed down like an iron press, stealing breath, stealing hope. Outside, the sun blazed merciless over a town that had already decided her worth. She had until sundown. After that, the road to nowhere, and a shallow grave for dreams. If you want to see how desperation becomes destiny, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Evelyn's story travels. The saloon stank of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and something worse, the acrid scent of desperation. Evelyn Hart had learned to recognize that smell. It clung to her now, soaked into the faded calico dress she'd worn for 3 days straight, mixed with the dust of 200 miles and the fever sweat of her youngest child. She stood on a wooden platform that had been hastily assembled that morning, splinters catching at her bare feet through the holes in her worn boots. Around her, men sat sprawled in chairs or leaned against the bar, their faces ruddy from drink and sun, their eyes calculating. They weren't looking at her face. They were counting. 5 children. 5 mouths to feed. 5 reasons to walk away. Gentlemen! Gentlemen! The auctioneer, a rail-thin man named Dobbs, with a voice like gravel sliding down a metal chute, raised his hands for silence. The gesture was unnecessary. Most of the men had already lost interest. We have here Mrs. Evelyn Hart, widowed these 6 months, with 5 healthy children. Healthy? Someone snorted from the back. The little one looks half dead already. Evelyn's arms tightened around Clara, her 3-year-old daughter, whose small body radiated heat like a coal stove. The child's breathing came shallow and quick, and her eyes, when they opened, held a glassy confusion that twisted Evelyn's heart into knots. She's just overcome by the heat, Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. She'll be fine with proper care. Proper care costs money. This from a bearded man in the front row, his shirt stained dark with sweat under the arms. What's she bringing to the table besides mouths to feed? Dobbs cleared his throat. Mrs. Hart is an experienced homesteader. She can cook, sew, manage livestock, tend gardens. Can she birth more brats? Another man called out, and laughter rippled through the room like heat shimmer on a dusty road. Evelyn felt her daughter Lily, 9 years old and fierce as a wildcat, press against her leg. On her other side, Samuel, her eldest at 12, stood rigid with fury, his fists clenched white. Behind them, the twins, Margaret and James, both 7, huddled together, their faces streaked with tear tracks through the dust. This was what it had come to, standing in front of strange men while they appraised her like livestock. But the alternative was worse, much worse. The wagon had broken down 15 miles outside of Redemption Springs. The axle had simply snapped, worn through by too many miles over too much rough country. They'd walked the rest of the way in the blazing August sun, carrying what little they could, leaving behind everything else. The tin plates her mother had given her, the quilt she'd sewn for her wedding, Samuel's father's rifle. By the time they'd stumbled into town, Clara was already burning up, her small body limp in Evelyn's arms. The doctor, a kind-faced man who'd examined Clara with gentle hands, had been blunt. The child has heat sickness and the start of fever. She needs rest, cool water, proper food. Without it, he hadn't finished the sentence. He hadn't needed to. Treatment cost money, food cost money, a room cost money. And Evelyn Hart had exactly 37 cents to her name. The town matron, Mrs. Pemberton, had found her sitting outside the doctor's office, Clara unconscious in her lap, the other children gathered around like scared rabbits. The older woman had looked at them with something between pity and disgust. "There's a cattle broker's auction tonight," she'd said, her voice crisp. "They're looking for mail-order brides, ranch hands, farmers, men who need wives. It's not ideal, but given your circumstances." Evelyn had understood immediately. Given her circumstances, widowed, penniless, with 5 children and no prospects, she had exactly one commodity to sell: herself. Now, standing on this platform while men debated her worth in dollars and cents, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But when she looked down at Clara's flushed face, felt the terrifying heat radiating from her small body, she knew she'd do it again. She'd do whatever it took. "Let's start the bidding at $5, Dobbs announced. $5 for a wife and ready-made family." Silence. The men shifted in their seats, suddenly fascinated by their drinks or the ceiling beams or anything except the woman on the platform. $4? Dobbs' voice had taken on a desperate edge. "Surely someone needs a wife. Look at her. Strong, capable, young enough to bear more children if that's your want." More silence. Evelyn felt it like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The saloon was stifling, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed men. Through the open door, she could see the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. Sundown. That's what the town marshal had told her. She had until sundown to find a solution, or he'd have to enforce the vagrancy laws, which meant jail for her, and the children scattered to whoever would take them. If anyone would take them. $3. Dobbs was sweating now, dabbing at his forehead with a stained handkerchief. $3 is a bargain for a wife, gentlemen. Think of it as an investment. An investment in poverty, someone muttered. Lily's hand found Evelyn's, small fingers gripping tight. Evelyn squeezed back, trying to communicate strength she didn't feel. Behind her, she heard Samuel's ragged breathing, the sound of a boy trying desperately not to cry. $2. Dobbs's voice had gone flat. Final offer. $2, and I'll throw in a voucher for supplies at Peterson's general store. The men began to stand, scraping chairs across the wooden floor, adjusting their hats, clearly ready to move on to the evening's drinking. Evelyn felt something crack inside her chest, not quite breaking, but fracturing, like ice under too much weight. "Wait." The voice came from the doorway, quiet but carrying. The room fell silent. A man stood silhouetted against the dying sunlight, dust motes dancing around him in the golden light. He was tall. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed, with broad shoulders that filled the doorframe. As he stepped inside, the light caught his face. Weathered, she thought. That was the word. Weathered, like old leather left too long in the sun. Lines bracketed his mouth and creased the corners of his eyes. His hair, dark brown shot through with premature gray, was too long, curling at his collar. His clothes, denim pants, a faded blue shirt, a vest that had seen better days, were covered in the kind of dust that spoke of long miles traveled. But it was his eyes that held her. Gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains. Tired eyes, sad eyes. Eyes that had seen too much and expected too little. He walked through the room with the careful gait of a man who'd learned to conserve energy, who knew the value of not wasting motion in the brutal summer heat. The crowd parted for him, and Evelyn noticed the way some of the men nodded, while others deliberately looked away. "Boone," Dobbs said, and there was surprise in his voice, and something else. Pity, maybe. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Didn't expect to be here." The man, Boone, stopped a few feet from the platform. Up close, Evelyn could see more. The scar that ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline. The careful way he held his left arm, as if favoring old pain. The boots worn thin at the heels, the shirt with neat patches at the elbows. Pride and poverty, all mixed together. His gaze moved over her, but not the way the other men had looked. He wasn't calculating her breeding potential or counting her children like livestock. He was studying her face, and she had the strangest feeling he was seeing things she'd tried hard to hide. The exhaustion, the fear, the desperate fraying hope. "You're the widow?" His voice matched his eyes, quiet, weathered with an unexpected gentleness. "Yes." Her own voice came out stronger than she felt. "Evelyn Hart. These are my children, Samuel, Lily, Margaret, James, and Clara." She adjusted her hold on the youngest, who whimpered softly against her shoulder. Boone's gaze moved over each child in turn, and Evelyn saw something shift in his expression when he looked at Clara's flushed face. "The little one's sick." "Heat sickness," Evelyn said quickly. The doctor says with rest and proper care, I know what heat sickness looks like. He turned to Dobbs. $2, you said? Dobbs blinked. Well, yes, but Boone, you can't possibly. I mean, your situation. $2. Boone reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Evelyn heard the clink of coins, a thin sound, not much metal meeting metal. He counted carefully, and she could see his jaw tighten with each coin placed in Dobbs' outstretched hand. When he was done, the pouch hung limp in his hand. Empty. Boone, for God's sake, Dobbs said quietly. That was all you had. It's enough. Boone turned back to Evelyn. I have a ranch about 15 miles north of here. It's not much. Drought's hit hard, and I'm behind on payments to the bank. The house needs work. The barn needs work. Everything needs work. He paused, and something flickered in those storm cloud eyes. I won't lie to you about what you're walking into. It'll be hard, harder than you've probably known. But your children will have a roof and food. The little one will have a chance to get well. Evelyn stared at him, this stranger who'd just spent his last $2 on a woman and 5 children he didn't know. Around them, the saloon had gone quiet again, but this was a different kind of silence. Shocked, disbelieving. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Boone's mouth quirked, not quite a smile. You're still standing. What? You're still standing, he repeated. After whatever brought you here, after walking your children into this town with a sick baby in your arms, after standing on this platform while men treated you like commodity, you're still standing. He glanced at her children. They're all still standing. That takes strength. I could use that kind of strength. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even particularly kind. But it was honest, and Evelyn had learned to value honesty above almost everything else. I accept, she said. Dobbs cleared his throat. Well then, I suppose Reverend Morrison is over at the church. He can perform a ceremony if— No ceremony. Boone's voice was flat. Just the papers. Legal and binding, nothing more. Thing. Something in Evelyn's chest tightened at that, but she pushed it down. This wasn't a love match. This was survival. She'd known that when she stepped onto this platform. 20 minutes later, she stood outside the saloon with a marriage certificate that still smelled of fresh ink and a husband whose last name she'd only just learned, Caleb Boone. The name felt strange in her mouth, foreign, like trying on someone else's clothes. Caleb had disappeared into the general store with the voucher Dobbs had given him, leaving Evelyn with the children on the wooden sidewalk. The sun hung low on the horizon now, painting everything gold and orange, and the heat was finally, mercifully, beginning to ease. Mama? Lily's voice was small. Is he going to hurt us? Evelyn knelt down, gathering her daughter close despite the heat. Samuel moved in too, and then the twins, all of them pressing together in a tight knot of familiar bodies. Clara stirred in her arms, mumbling something incoherent. I don't think so, Evelyn said honestly. I think he's just a man who needs help as much as we do. He looks sad, Margaret whispered. He does, Evelyn agreed, but so do we sometimes. Sad doesn't mean bad. Samuel, ever practical, asked the question they were all thinking. What if his ranch is awful? What if there's no food, no water? What if— Then we'll survive anyway. Evelyn cupped her son's face in her free hand. That's what hearts do. We survive. The door to the general store opened and Caleb emerged carrying 2 burlap sacks. He paused when he saw them clustered together, and something crossed his face. Loneliness, maybe, or recognition of it. Wagon's around back, he said. It's not much, but it'll get us home before full dark. The wagon was indeed not much. Old wood patched in places, pulled by 2 horses that looked as worn and tired as everything else. But it was transportation, and after walking 15 miles, Evelyn wasn't about to complain. Caleb helped the children into the back with surprising gentleness, making sure they were settled on some old blankets he'd spread out. When he turned to help Evelyn, she saw him hesitate, his hand extended but not quite touching. I can manage, she said, and climbed up to the seat beside him, still cradling Clara. He didn't speak as they rolled out of Redemption Springs, and Evelyn was grateful for the silence. Behind them, she could hear the children whispering, their voices a soft murmur beneath the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of horse hooves. The land stretched out endlessly in all directions, painted in shades of gold and amber by the setting sun. Beautiful in its own harsh way, but also unforgiving. The grass was sparse, burned brown by the relentless summer heat. Here and there she saw the bleached bones of cattle that hadn't survived the drought, picked clean by scavengers. "It wasn't always like this," Caleb said suddenly, his voice startling her. 3 years ago, this land was green. Water ran in the creeks, cattle were fat. He gestured at the desolation around them. Then the rain stopped coming, and they just kept not coming. "How bad is it?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Bad?" He didn't elaborate, but she could hear volumes in that single word. "There's a man named Harlan Crow, owns the biggest spread in 3 counties. He's been buying up failing ranches for pennies on the dollar, then consolidating the water rights. If you don't have water, you don't have cattle. If you don't have cattle, you don't have money. If you don't have money—" He trailed off, but the ending was clear enough. "You lose everything." "Yeah." He glanced at her, then back at the road. "I'm hanging on by my fingernails. The bank's been patient, but patience only goes so far. I've got maybe 3 months before they foreclose." Evelyn absorbed this information, adding it to the mental ledger of their situation. A failing ranch, a man at the end of his rope, a stranger who'd spent his last $2 on a woman and her children. "Why did you bid on me?" she asked. "If things are that bad, why take on 5 more mouths to feed?" Caleb was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the wagon's creaking. "I had a family once, a wife, a daughter." He swallowed hard, and Evelyn saw his hands tighten on the reins. "Fever took them both 4 years ago. This ranch. I built it for them. Every fence post, every board in that house, I put there thinking about giving them a good life." He paused, and the silence stretched between them like the darkening land. "After they died, I kept working, kept trying, but I couldn't remember why anymore. Couldn't remember what it was all for." He turned to look at her then, and in the dying light his eyes were the color of steel. "When I saw you standing there, refusing to break, refusing to beg, keeping your children close and your head high." He stopped, shook his head. "I remembered. That's why." Evelyn didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But she understood, in a way that went deeper than words. They were both people who'd lost everything except the will to keep going, and sometimes that was enough. The sun had fully set by the time the ranch came into view. In the twilight, Evelyn could make out a house, small, single-story, with a sagging porch, a barn that listed slightly to one side, corrals with fence posts that needed replacing, and beyond it all, the endless stretch of dry land, colorless in the fading light. Home. For better or worse. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and sat for a moment staring at it as if seeing it through her eyes. "It's not much," he said again. "It's more than we had this morning," Evelyn replied, and meant it. He helped the children down, and Evelyn noticed how carefully he handled Clara, supporting her head, keeping her steady. Inside, he lit a lamp, and warm light spilled across a main room that was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace took up one wall. A rough-hewn table with mismatched chairs sat in the center. A door led off to what must be a bedroom. "There's only the one bedroom," Caleb said, and Evelyn heard embarrassment in his voice. "I'll sleep in the barn. You and the children take the house." "You don't have to "I do." His voice was firm. "We may be legally married, Mrs. Boone, but we're strangers. You'll have privacy until you decide otherwise. If you decide otherwise." Mrs. Boone. The name still felt strange, but hearing him say it made it somehow more real. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded and began unpacking the supplies he'd bought. Basic staples, nothing fancy, but enough. Flour, beans, salt pork, cornmeal, a small tin of peppermint candy that he handed to Lily with a gruff, "For later." "There's a well out back," he said as he worked. "Water's still good, though the level's dropped. Pump's temperamental. You have to work it a bit to get it going. Kitchen garden's mostly dead, but there might be some squash and beans left if you look hard. Chickens in the coop, 6 hens, no rooster. They're not laying much in this heat, but sometimes you'll get lucky. He continued listing the inventory of his failing ranch, and Evelyn listened, filing away each detail. This was her life now. This struggling patch of drought-stricken land, this stranger with sad eyes, this house that needed her as much as she needed it. When Caleb finished, he stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, clearly unsure what to do next. Samuel had already started exploring with the twins, and Lily was examining the peppermint tin with wonder. In Evelyn's arms, Clara had finally fallen into a deeper sleep, her breathing less labored. "I'll get settled in the barn," Caleb said. "If you need anything, Mr. Boone." Evelyn stopped him with her voice. "Caleb?" His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate despite the distance between them. "Thank you. For the chance, for all of it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something complicated move across his face. Loneliness, hope, fear, all the things she was feeling reflected back at her. $2, he said softly. "Best money I ever spent." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Evelyn alone with her children in this strange new place that was somehow, impossibly, home. She laid Clara down on the bed in the bedroom, checking her temperature with a hand to the forehead. Still too warm, but not burning the way she had been. The rest and shade were already helping. Margaret and James climbed up beside their little sister, and Lily joined them, all four curling together the way they had in the wagon, in the long walk before that, in all the difficult days since their father died. Samuel stood in the doorway, watching her with two old eyes. "Is it going to be okay, Mama?" he asked. Evelyn looked around the small, sparse room, at the house that needed work, at the land beyond that was dying from drought, at the precarious future they'd just bought for $2 and a hasty marriage. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but we're here. We're together. And tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." It wasn't a promise, it wasn't even particularly reassuring, but it was true, and truth was all she had left to give. Outside, she could hear Caleb moving around in the barn, settling in for the night. A stranger who was now her husband, a man who'd given them a chance when no one else would. $2, she thought. $2 and two people at the end of their ropes, reaching for something, anything, to hold on to. She hoped it would be enough. The night pressed in around the small ranch house, bringing with it the sounds of the frontier, crickets singing their desperate songs, coyotes calling in the distance, the wind rattling through dry grass. Evelyn stood at the window, looking out at the barn where a single lamp glowed in the darkness. Behind her, her children slept, their breathing a soft chorus of life and need and hope. Ahead of her, tomorrow waited with all its unknowns. But for now, in this moment, they were safe, fed, sheltered. It was more than they'd had at sundown. It was enough to build on. And Evelyn Hart, no, Evelyn Boone now, had always been good at building something from nothing. The real work would start tomorrow. Dawn came hard and bright, spilling through the window like liquid fire. Evelyn woke to the sound of a rooster that didn't exist and realized it was Samuel, already up, trying to coax the temperamental pump into yielding water. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the other children still tangled together on the bed, and stepped out into the morning. The heat hit her immediately, even at this early hour. The sun was barely above the horizon, but already the air shimmered with it, pressing down on everything like a heavy hand. Samuel had his shirt off, his thin shoulders working as he cranked the pump handle with determination. "Let me help," Evelyn said, and together they worked the stubborn mechanism until finally, blessedly, water began to sputter out. Brown at first, then clearing to something that looked almost clean. "It's harder than it looks," Samuel said, breathing hard. "Everything here is going to be harder than it looks." Evelyn filled the bucket they'd found near the well. "But we've done hard before." "Not like this." Her son looked around at the parched land, the dying grass, the fence posts that leaned like tired old men. "Papa's farm wasn't like this." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It wasn't." Samuel's father had been a careful man, methodical, good with his hands. He'd built them a decent life in Missouri, not rich, but comfortable. Then the consumption had taken him, slow and cruel, eating away at his lungs until there was nothing left but blood-flecked handkerchiefs and a widow with 5 children and debts she couldn't pay. The bank had taken the farm. She'd sold everything that wasn't nailed down, bought passage west on the promise of cheaper land and new starts, and then the wagon had broken and Clara had gotten sick, and here they were. $2 and a stranger's charity away from the grave. Mama, Samuel's voice pulled her back. What if we can't do this? What if it's too much? Evelyn set down the bucket and cupped her son's face in both hands, looking into eyes that were trying so hard to be brave. Then we'll fail. But we'll fail trying, and that's better than not trying at all. Is it? Yes. She said it with more conviction than she felt. It is. The barn door opened and Caleb emerged, his shirt already dark with sweat despite the early hour. He stopped when he saw them, and Evelyn watched something shift in his expression, surprise maybe, that they were already up and working. Coffee's on the stove, he said. Such as it is. Mostly chicory these days, but it's hot and bitter enough to wake you up. Thank you. Evelyn picked up the bucket. I'll get breakfast started. What do you normally eat? Caleb shrugged. Whatever I can make quick. Johnny cakes, usually. Sometimes beans if I remember to soak them the night before. I can do better than that, Evelyn said, and saw skepticism flicker across his face. She didn't blame him. Yesterday she'd been standing on an auction platform. Today she was making promises about breakfast, but she'd learned long ago that competence was the best response to doubt. Inside she found the kitchen area, a wood stove, a dry sink, shelves with sparse supplies. She sent Samuel to gather eggs while she mixed cornmeal with the precious water, adding a bit of the salt pork for flavor. By the time the twins woke up, rubbing sleep from their eyes, she had Johnny cakes cooking on the griddle and actual coffee, weak but real, heating in a battered pot. Caleb came in as she was plating the food. He stood in the doorway, staring at the table that now held actual breakfast instead of whatever he'd been eating alone for the past 4 years, and something in his face made Evelyn's chest tight. Sit, she said gently. While it's hot. They ate in awkward silence, the children uncertain, Caleb clearly unused to sharing his space. But Evelyn noticed he made sure the children got the largest portions, taking less for himself. She noticed, too, the way his hand shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, the tremor of a man running on empty for too long. When breakfast was done, Caleb pushed back from the table. I need to ride out to the north pasture, check on what's left of the herd. Should be back by midday. He hesitated, then looked at Evelyn. You don't have to. If you need to rest with the children, we'll manage, Evelyn said. What needs doing around here? Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then gestured toward the window. Everything. But the garden's probably the most urgent. If you can salvage anything from it, we'll eat better come fall, provided we're still here come fall. The last part was said under his breath, but Evelyn heard it. She waited until he'd ridden out on a rangy sorrel horse before gathering the children. All right, she said, let's see what we're working with. The garden was a disaster. What had once been neat rows was now mostly dust and dead stalks. But Evelyn had grown up on a farm, had learned at her mother's knee how to coax life from stubborn soil. She knelt in the dirt, the heat already making her sweat, and began to search. There, a squash plant, barely alive but still green at the roots, and there, bean vines that might produce if given water and care. Tomato plants that were more stick than leaf, but that showed tiny buds of possibility. Samuel, get the bucket. We're going to water these every morning and evening, whether they deserve it or not. Lily, you and the twins pull these dead plants. Carefully, we don't want to disturb anything that might still be alive. They worked through the morning, and Evelyn felt something in her chest loosen. This was familiar. This was something she knew how to do. Dirt under her fingernails, sun on her back, children working beside her. These were the components of the life she'd known before everything fell apart. By the time the sun reached its zenith, they'd cleared half the garden and watered everything that showed even the slightest sign of life. Clara, much improved after a night's rest and steady water, sat in the shade of the house playing with smooth stones Lily had found for her. Margaret discovered a half-wild cat living in the barn and spent an hour trying to coax it close with bits of salt pork. Evelyn was checking the chicken coop, 6 scrawny hens, just as Caleb had said, and only 2 eggs to show for it, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Multiple horses, coming fast. Her stomach tightened. She moved to where she could see the road and watched as 3 riders approached. They weren't racing exactly, but they weren't taking their time either. As they got closer, she could make out details. Well-dressed men, good horses, the kind of people who didn't visit struggling ranches unless they wanted something. The lead rider pulled up in front of the house, and Evelyn got her first good look at him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. He wore a suit despite the heat, and his horse, a magnificent black gelding, showed not a hint of the rough treatment most ranch horses endured. "Well, well," the man said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Caleb's been holding out on us. Didn't mention he'd acquired a wife." Evelyn didn't like his tone, didn't like the way he looked at her, assessing, calculating. "Can I help you?" "Where's Boone?" "Out checking the herd." The man dismounted, and his companions did the same. "I'm Harlan Crow. I own the Triple C, the largest ranch in 3 counties. These are my associates, Mr. Jennings and Mr. Wade." The name sent a chill through her despite the heat. This was the man Caleb had mentioned, the one buying up failing ranches. "Mrs. Boone," she said, keeping her voice level. "Pleasure to meet you." "Boone, is it?" Crow's smile didn't reach his eyes. "How long have you been married?" "That's our business." "Of course." "Of course." He walked closer, and Evelyn held her ground even though everything in her wanted to step back. "I'm just surprised. Caleb's been alone so long we all thought he'd dried up and blown away. Where'd he find you?" "Redemption Springs." "Ah." Something flickered in Crow's expression. Understanding, maybe, or contempt. "The auction. How much did he pay?" Evelyn felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the sun. "I don't see how that's your concern." "Everything that happens on this range is my concern, Mrs. Boone, especially when it involves a ranch that's 3 months from foreclosure." He gestured at the land around them. "Look at this place, dying on its feet. The smart thing, the kind thing, really, would be for Caleb to sell now, while he can still get something for it. I've made him generous offers. He's not interested in selling. Maybe not, but banks don't care about interest. They care about money, and Caleb doesn't have any." Crow moved closer still, near enough that Evelyn could smell his cologne, expensive, incongruous in this harsh place. "I'll give you some advice, Mrs. Boone, free of charge. Cut your losses. Take those children." His gaze flickered to where the children had gathered near the house, watching with wide eyes. "And get out while you still can. This ranch is finished. Caleb's finished. You don't want to go down with him." "I appreciate your concern," Evelyn said, each word precise and cold. "But we'll manage our own affairs." Crow studied her for a long moment, then laughed, a sound without humor. "Your funeral. Or more likely, your slow starvation. But don't say I didn't warn you." He turned back to his horse, then paused. "Oh, and tell Caleb I'll be by next week to check on those water rights. The ones I hold the note on. Might need to restrict his access if the drought continues. Can't have him wasting water on a dying operation when my cattle need it." "You can't do that. He needs that water." "I can do whatever the contract allows me to do, Mrs. Boone. And the contract, which Caleb signed when he was desperate enough to take any terms, allows me quite a lot." He mounted his horse in one smooth motion. 1 month. That's how long I give this place. Then Caleb will be begging to sell, and my offer won't be nearly as generous. He rode off, his companions following, leaving a cloud of dust that hung in the still air like a threat. Evelyn stood there, watching until they disappeared, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Around her, the children emerged from their hiding spots. "Mama?" Lily's voice was small. "Who was that?" "Trouble," Evelyn said quietly. "That was trouble." Caleb returned an hour later, his face grim. Evelyn met him at the barn, where he was unsaddling his horse with movements that spoke of exhaustion and defeat. "We lost 3 more head," he said without preamble. "Just dead in the pasture. Couldn't get to water in time." He paused in his work, his hand stilling on the saddle. "I've got maybe 20 cattle left, 20 out of what used to be 150. Harlan Crow was here." Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes sharp. "What did he want?" "To remind us we're failing. to offer to buy you out, to threaten your water access. Evelyn crossed her arms. Why didn't you tell me he holds notes on your water rights? Because it's complicated. Caleb went back to unsaddling with more force than necessary. 3 years ago, when the drought started, I needed money to keep operating. The bank wouldn't lend me anymore, so Crow offered a private loan. The terms seemed fair at the time, interest payments, secured against my water access. I didn't think... He trailed off, shook his head. I didn't think the drought would last this long. Didn't think he'd use it against me. Can he really restrict your water? If I default on the loan payments, yes, and I'm already 2 months behind. He pulled the saddle off and set it on the rail with careful precision, as if concentrating on this simple task could somehow make everything else simpler too. So you see what you've married into. A dying ranch, debts I can't pay, and a vulture circling overhead waiting to pick the bones clean. Evelyn watched him for a moment, this man who'd spent his last $2 on her and her children, who was clearly drowning but still trying to swim. How much do you owe him? On the water loan? $300 plus interest. It's probably closer to $400 by now. $400. It might as well have been $4,000 or $4 million. And the bank? For the ranch itself? $1,200, due in 3 months. The numbers were staggering, impossible. Evelyn felt the weight of them settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. What can we do? Caleb laughed, but there was no humor in it. We can pray for rain, or a miracle, or both. He finally looked at her directly, and his eyes were hollow. I'm sorry. I should have told you how bad it was before you agreed to this. You could have what? Gone back to that platform? Let my children starve? Evelyn shook her head. We're here now. That's what matters. So what do we do? I don't know. The admission seemed to cost him something. I've been trying for 3 years to figure it out, and I still don't know. They stood in the barn's dimness, the heat pressing down, the weight of impossible circumstances hanging between them. Outside, Evelyn could hear her children playing, Margaret's laugh, James calling out about something, the ordinary sounds of childhood that seemed out of place in this desperate situation. My husband, Evelyn said slowly. My first husband. He used to say that the difference between surviving and thriving was knowing which battles to fight. She turned to face Caleb fully. We can't fight the drought. We can't fight the bank. But maybe we can fight Crow. How? He's got the money, the power, He's got arrogance, Evelyn interrupted. I saw it in his eyes. He thinks you're already beaten. He thinks I'm going to run. He thinks this ranch is his for the taking. He's just waiting for you to realize it. She paused, letting her next words carry weight. What if we prove him wrong? With what? Hope and determination? Caleb's voice was bitter. Those don't pay debts. No, but they keep you moving long enough to find what does. Evelyn thought about the garden she'd worked that morning, the way even dying plants could sometimes be coaxed back to life with enough attention and water. You said Crow's been buying up ranches, which means other people are in the same situation we are. Maybe worse. So maybe we're not fighting this alone. Maybe if we can find the others, pool what resources we have, we can... She stopped, realizing she didn't actually have an end to that sentence. We can do something. Anything's better than just waiting to die. Caleb studied her for a long moment, and Evelyn saw the war happening behind his eyes. Hope versus experience. Possibility versus probability. Finally, he let out a long breath. There's a man named Dutch Hendricks. Has a small spread about 10 miles east. He's been holding on by his fingernails, same as me. And the widow Morrison, her husband died last spring, left her with a ranch she doesn't know how to run. There are others. He rubbed his face with both hands. But even if we band together, I don't see how it helps. Crow's got us all by the throat. Then we figure out how to make him let go. Evelyn said it with more confidence than she felt. Tomorrow, we ride out, talk to these people, see what they know, what they need, what they can offer. We start there. And the ranch? The cattle that are dying, the debts that are mounting? We do what we can. Keep the garden alive, keep the children fed, keep moving. Evelyn met his eyes steadily. That's all any of us can do. Keep moving until we find a way through. Caleb looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language, like the concept of not giving up was something he'd forgotten existed. Then slowly something shifted in his expression. Not hope, exactly, but maybe the memory of what hope felt like. "All right," he said quietly. "We try. God knows I don't have any better ideas." That night, after the children were asleep and Caleb had retreated to the barn, Evelyn sat at the rough table and took stock of their situation by the light of a single candle. The numbers weren't good. 20 cattle, worth maybe $10 a head if they could get them to market, 6 chickens producing 2 eggs a day if they were lucky, a garden that might yield enough vegetables to supplement their diet through fall, and debts that loomed like storm clouds on a clear horizon. Against this, they had her determination, Caleb's knowledge of ranching, 5 children who needed feeding, and the slimmest thread of possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to survive. She thought about Harlan Crow's cold eyes, his casual certainty that they would fail, thought about the auction platform and the men who'd looked at her like she was livestock, thought about every time someone had counted her out, written her off, assumed she would break. "We're still standing," she whispered to the darkness, repeating Caleb's words back to herself. "That has to count for something." The candle burned lower, wax pooling on the scarred wood of the table. Outside, the night was alive with sounds, insects, distant coyotes, the restless movement of wind through dry grass. And underneath it all, the steady breathing of her children, the quiet sounds of Caleb settling in the barn, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing despite everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. More heat, more struggle, more reasons to give up. But tomorrow would also bring another chance to prove everyone wrong. Another day to keep standing when the world expected them to fall. Evelyn blew out the candle and made her way to the bedroom in the dark, navigating by memory and touch. She lay down beside her children, fitting herself into the spaces between their sleeping bodies, and closed her eyes. The $2 bride, she thought. That's what they'd call her if they knew. The woman who sold herself and her children for the price of a decent meal. But she preferred to think of it differently. She was the woman who'd recognized an opportunity when she saw it. The woman who'd bet everything on a stranger's sad eyes and the strength she'd seen in them, buried deep under layers of grief and defeat. The woman who was still standing, and who planned to keep standing no matter what Harlan Crow or the drought or the debts or anything else threw at them. In the darkness, Clara stirred against her side, mumbling in her sleep. Evelyn stroked her daughter's hair, feeling the coolness of her forehead, the steady rhythm of her breathing. Better. She was getting better. That was something. That was enough to build on. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, carrying with it the scent of dust and distance and the faint, impossible promise of rain that never came. But Evelyn had stopped waiting for rain. She'd learned that you couldn't control the weather, couldn't force water from an empty sky. All you could control was your own 2 hands and what you chose to do with them. Tomorrow, those hands would work the garden, care for the children, reach out to strangers who might become allies. Tomorrow, she would start building something from the ruins of Caleb's dying ranch and her own shattered life. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But tonight, in this moment of quiet darkness, surrounded by her sleeping children in a house that was slowly becoming home, Evelyn allowed herself to simply rest, to gather her strength for the battles ahead, to remember that surviving was sometimes its own kind of victory. She fell asleep thinking about water rights and desperate ranchers, and a man with storm cloud eyes who'd given her a chance when no one else would. Fell asleep planning, hoping, refusing to surrender to the impossible odds stacked against them. The $2 bride, buying back her future one day at a time. The sun wasn't yet fully risen when Caleb and Evelyn rode out the next morning, leaving Samuel in charge of the younger children with strict instructions about the garden and staying close to the house. The boy had nodded with the grave responsibility of someone twice his age, and Evelyn's heart had ached watching him square his thin shoulders against the weight of it. They rode in silence for the first mile, Evelyn on the gentle mare Caleb had saddled for her, both horses moving slow to conserve energy in the building heat. The land stretched endlessly around them, brown and brittle, punctuated here and there by the skeletal remains of trees that had given up waiting for rain. "Dutch's place is the closer one," Caleb finally said. his voice rough from disuse. If he's even still there. Last I heard, he was down to selling off equipment just to buy feed. When was the last time you talked to him? A month, maybe 2. We used to help each other during Roundup, back when there was enough cattle to make Roundup worthwhile. He gestured at the desolate landscape. Drought makes hermits of us all. Easier to die alone than watch each other starve. The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut, and Evelyn didn't try to soften it with empty platitudes. She understood that kind of despair, had tasted it herself standing on that auction platform. Dutch Hendrick's ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage, shimmering in the heat. As they drew closer, Evelyn could see it was in even worse shape than Caleb's place. The house leaned visibly to one side, and the barn's roof had partially collapsed. Cattle were nowhere in sight. A man emerged from the house as they approached, rifle held loose but ready. He was weathered as old boot leather, somewhere past 50, with a gray beard that hadn't seen scissors in months. "Caleb Boone," his voice carried across the dusty yard. "Heard you bought yourself a wife, didn't believe it." "Believe it." Caleb dismounted and helped Evelyn down. "Dutch, this is Evelyn. Evelyn, Dutch Hendricks, the stubbornest man in 3 counties. Takes one to know one." Dutch lowered the rifle but didn't set it aside. "What brings you out here? If you're looking to borrow something, I got nothing left to lend." "Not borrowing, talking." Caleb glanced at Evelyn, and she saw uncertainty flicker across his face, as if he still wasn't sure this was a good idea. "About Harlan Crow." Dutch's expression hardened. "What about him?" "He came by my place yesterday, making threats about water rights, talking about foreclosure like it's already done." Caleb paused. "I'm thinking he's doing the same to you." "Worse." Dutch spat into the dust. "He cut off my water access 2 weeks ago, said I defaulted on the loan. My cattle died in 3 days." He gestured toward the empty pasture. "Every last one. 30 years of building a herd, gone because I couldn't make a payment I never should have had to make in the first place." Evelyn stepped forward. "What do you mean, never should have had to make?" Dutch looked at her properly for the first time, his eyes sharp despite the weariness etched in every line of his face. "The loan agreement. Crow wrote it so the interest compounds monthly instead of yearly. Wrote it in language so dense you'd need a lawyer to parse it, and the nearest lawyer is 3 days' ride. By the time I realized what I'd signed, I was already drowning." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Turned out that was the point. "How many others?" Evelyn asked. "What? How many other ranchers did he do this to?" Dutch studied her for a long moment. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" "I'm thinking that one rancher against Crow doesn't stand a chance. But 5, 10, 20 ranchers with the same story?" Evelyn felt something crystallize in her mind, sharp and clear. "That's not bad luck. That's a pattern. That's evidence." "Evidence don't mean much when the judge is in Crow's pocket," Dutch said flatly. "Maybe not the local judge, but territorial authorities? Federal marshals?" Evelyn looked between the 2 men. "Crow's smart, but he's also arrogant. He thinks nobody will fight back because we're all too desperate, too scattered, too defeated." "What if we prove him wrong?" Caleb shook his head. "Even if we could prove fraud, and that's a big if, it would take months, years maybe. We don't have that kind of time." "Then we buy time." Evelyn's mind was racing now, connecting pieces. "We find every rancher he's cheated. We pool our resources, cattle, equipment, labor. We help each other survive long enough to fight back properly." "With what money?" Dutch's voice was harsh. "I'm flat broke. Caleb's 3 months from foreclosure. The others are in the same boat, or worse." "Then we don't fight with money. We fight with what we have." Evelyn turned to Caleb. "You said there's a cattle market in Cheyenne, right? That's where you used to take your herd?" "Used to, before the drought killed most of them." "But the market's still there, and cattle still sell." She was thinking out loud now, following the thread of an idea that felt simultaneously desperate and possible. "What if we combined what cattle we all have left, made one big drive instead of each of us trying to sell a handful here and there? Bigger herd means better prices, means more bargaining power." "That's insane," Caleb said. "A cattle drive in this heat, across drought-stricken country, with animals that are already half dead from thirst?" "You have a better idea?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Dutch was watching them both with something that might have been interest flickering behind the exhaustion. "How many cattle you got left?" Dutch asked Caleb. 20, maybe, if I haven't lost more since yesterday. I got nothing, but I got a wagon that still runs, and I know the trail to Cheyenne like the back of my hand. Dutch scratched his beard. Widow Morrison, she's got maybe 15 head. The Chen family, they've been running sheep, but they got a few cattle mixed in. The Halversons, before they gave up and headed back east, they mentioned the Johnsons still had some livestock. So maybe 60, 70 head total, Evelyn was calculating. What would that bring at market? In good times? $8, $10 a head? Now? Caleb shrugged. Maybe 5 if we're lucky. Maybe nothing if they're too weak to be worth buying. $350 at best. Not enough to save everyone, but maybe enough to buy time, pay the most pressing debts, keep the wolves at bay a little longer. It's not enough, Dutch said, reading her expression. It's more than we have now. Evelyn looked at both men. And it's not just about the money. It's about showing Crow we're not going to roll over. It's about proving to ourselves we can still fight. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wind moving through dead grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. We'd need water for the drive, Caleb finally said, and Evelyn recognized the shift in his voice. He was thinking practically now, considering possibilities instead of just counting impossibilities. The usual water holes are probably dry. Not all of them, Dutch said slowly. There's a spring about 40 miles north, up in the foothills. It was still flowing last I heard. And old man Garrett, he's got a well that's deep enough it hasn't run dry yet. If we could get permission to water there. Garrett hates Crow, Caleb said. Crow tried to buy him out 5 years ago, and Garrett told him to go to hell. He might help just for the spite of it. They were planning now, the three of them, talking over each other, pointing out problems and solutions in the same breath. Evelyn listened and contributed where she could, feeling something unfamiliar and precious taking root in her chest. Hope. Fragile as new grass, but real. By the time they left Dutch's place 2 hours later, they had the skeleton of a plan. Visit the other struggling ranchers, take stock of what cattle and resources existed, set a date for the drive. It was madness, all of them agreed. But it was madness with purpose, which beat sitting around waiting to die. The widow Morrison lived another 8 miles east, in a house that had been built with care but was now succumbing to neglect. The fence posts leaned drunkenly, the gate hung by one hinge, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that had somehow survived the drought. She met them at the door with a shotgun and suspicious eyes, a woman perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of thinness that spoke of missed meals. Mrs. Morrison, I'm Caleb Boone. This is my wife, Evelyn. We met briefly last year at the church social. I remember. Her voice was clipped, wary. What do you want? To talk, Evelyn said. About Harlan Crow and water rights, and whether you're tired of losing yet. Something flickered in the widow's eyes. She looked past them, scanning the empty horizon as if checking for witnesses, then stepped back. Come in, but make it quick. I've got work to do. The inside of the house was neat despite its poverty, everything in its place, everything worn but clean. Mrs. Morrison gestured them to chairs at a kitchen table that had been built for a larger family, for better times. Crow came by last month, she said without preamble. Offered to buy my land for $200. When I refused, he suggested I might reconsider once my cattle started dying of thirst. She paused, her jaw tight. He wasn't wrong. I lost 6 head last week. Can't afford to lose more. How many do you have left? Caleb asked. 15, maybe 16. My son tried to count them yesterday, but they're scattered across the back pasture, trying to find grass that doesn't exist. She looked between them. Why are you asking? Evelyn laid out the plan. The idea of combining herds, making one large drive to Cheyenne, splitting the profits to buy time and resources to fight back properly. As she spoke, she watched Mrs. Morrison's face shift from skepticism to consideration to something that might have been desperate hope. It's risky, the widow said when Evelyn finished. Everything's risky right now. At least this way we're taking the risk together. And if it fails? If we lose the cattle on the drive, or can't get a fair price, or Crow finds out and sabotages us. Then we fail, Evelyn said simply. But we fail fighting, which is better than failing on our knees. Mrs. Morrison looked at her for a long moment, and Evelyn saw recognition there. One widow to another, one woman who'd lost everything to another who was still losing it. All right, she said quietly. Count me in. But I'm coming on the drive. Those are my cattle, and I'm not trusting their sale to anyone else. Fair enough, Caleb said. They visited 3 more ranches that day, and the story was the same at each one. Crushing debt, dying cattle, Harlan Crow circling like a vulture. The Chen family, immigrants who'd bought their land with money saved from 2 decades of backbreaking work, listened to the plan with careful attention and quiet dignity before agreeing to contribute their small herd. The Johnsons, an older couple whose children had all left for easier lives in the cities, offered their wagon and their knowledge of the trail. By the time Caleb and Evelyn rode back to their ranch as the sun was setting, they'd collected promises of 53 head of cattle, 2 wagons, and 6 adults willing to risk everything on a desperate summer cattle drive through country that was actively trying to kill them. We're insane, Caleb said as their house came into view. Probably, Evelyn agreed, but we're insane together, which has to count for something. The children met them at the door, Samuel reporting with pride that they'd watered the garden twice and collected 3 eggs, and Margaret had finally gotten the barn cat to take food from her hand. The simple domestic victories felt surreal against the backdrop of what Evelyn and Caleb were planning, but she embraced them anyway. This was what they were fighting for, after all. The right to have ordinary days, ordinary problems, ordinary joys. That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb knocked softly on the doorframe. Evelyn looked up from the mending she was doing by lamplight. Come in. He entered hesitantly, still treating the house like it wasn't quite his anymore, still maintaining the careful distance of a stranger. I wanted to say what you did today. The way you talked to them, got them to believe we might actually have a chance. I couldn't have done that. You could have. You just needed someone to do it first. Maybe. He leaned against the doorframe, and in the lamplight, Evelyn could see the exhaustion etched deep in his face. My wife, Sarah. She was like you. Saw possibilities where I only saw problems. Used to drive me crazy how optimistic she was. His voice caught. Turned out she was usually right. I'm not optimistic, Evelyn said quietly. I'm just stubborn. There's a difference. Is there? He almost smiled. Feels the same from where I'm standing. They looked at each other across the small room, 2 people bound by legal papers and desperation, slowly becoming something that might eventually resemble partners. We should leave in a week, Caleb said. Give everyone time to gather their cattle, make preparations. Any longer and we risk losing more animals to the heat. A week, Evelyn agreed. The children. We'll stay here. Samuel's old enough to manage things, and Mrs. Chen offered to check on them daily. He saw her expression and added, Unless you'd rather not go, I could handle the drive with the others. No, Evelyn set down her mending. I'm going. Those cattle represent our future. I'm not leaving that in anyone else's hands. He nodded, unsurprised. Then we've got a week to prepare. I'll start gathering what we'll need, supplies, maps, equipment. I'll make sure the children are ready to manage without us. Teach Samuel everything I can about the garden, the chickens, keeping Clara's fever from returning. She paused. And I'll pray we're not making a terrible mistake. We probably are, Caleb said, but at least it's our mistake to make. The week that followed was a blur of preparation and controlled chaos. Evelyn spent her days teaching Samuel to cook simple meals, showing Lily how to tend the garden, making sure the twins understood the importance of staying close to the house. Clara, fully recovered now, followed her everywhere like a small shadow, and Evelyn's heart broke every time she thought about leaving her, but she hardened herself to it. This was necessary. This was survival. Caleb worked from before dawn until after dark, repairing the wagon they'd use, checking every inch of tack and harness, making lists of supplies they'd need and crossing off half of them because they couldn't afford it. At night, he spread maps across the kitchen table and traced routes with a calloused finger, calculating distances between water sources, marking potential dangers. The first 40 miles are the worst, he told Evelyn on the 5th night. Flat, exposed, no water except what we carry. If we can make it to the foothills, there's the spring Dutch mentioned. After that, it's rough country, but there's more water. How many days? 10, if we're lucky and nothing goes wrong. 15, if we're not. 15 days. 2 weeks away from her children, gambling everything on half-starved cattle and the hope that Cheyenne prices hadn't collapsed completely. On the morning of the 7th day, they gathered at the old Johnson place, the rallying point they'd agreed on. Evelyn had said goodbye to her children before dawn, holding each one tight, memorizing the feel of them in case something went wrong. Samuel had been stoic, Lily tearful, the twins confused. Claire had clung to her neck and whispered, "Come back, Mama." And Evelyn had promised she would, even as her heart cracked with the weight of it. The assembled group was smaller than Evelyn had imagined when they'd been planning. Dutch was there with his wagon, looking grim but determined. The widow Morrison sat astride a rangy gelding, her shotgun strapped to her saddle. The Chen family had sent their eldest son, a quiet young man named Wei, who nodded respectfully but said little. Mr. Johnson manned the second wagon, his wife having stayed home to look after their place, and Caleb checking cinches and counting heads with the focused intensity of a man who knew everything depended on the next 2 weeks. The cattle were a sorry sight. 53 head, as promised, but thin as shadows, their ribs showing, their eyes dull with hunger and thirst. They milled restlessly, sensing the nervous energy of the humans around them. "This is what we're betting everything on, Mrs." Morrison said, riding up beside Evelyn. "Half-dead cattle and pure desperation." "It's more than Crow thinks we have," Evelyn replied. "True enough." The widow checked her rifle, settled it more comfortably across her saddle. "You ready for this? It's going to be hard, harder than you're probably imagining." "I've done hard before." "Not like this, you haven't. But I suppose you'll learn." Mrs. Morrison's voice was matter-of-fact rather than unkind. "Just remember, the cattle are worth more than we are. You have to choose between saving yourself and saving them. You save them. Otherwise, this whole thing is pointless." It was a brutal calculus, but Evelyn understood the truth of it. They were risking their lives for these animals because the animals represented hope, possibility, future. Without them, they had nothing to fight with. Caleb rode to the front of the group, his horse dancing sideways, picking up on the tension. "Everyone ready?" A chorus of grim affirmatives. "All right then." He looked back at the cattle, at the desperate people who'd gathered to make this last-ditch attempt at survival. "We stick together, we watch out for each other, and we get these animals to Cheyenne alive. Nothing else matters. Understood?" More nods. Evelyn saw Wei cross himself quickly, saw Mrs. Morrison's lips move in what might have been a prayer. Dutch just spat into the dust and took up the reins of his wagon. "Let's move out," Caleb said. The cattle drive began with the sharp calls of the riders and the crack of Dutch's whip over the wagon team's heads. The cattle, reluctant and weak, nonetheless began to move, flowing like a river of hide and horn across the parched land. Evelyn fell into position on the flank, keeping the stragglers moving, her mare responding to the lightest touch on the reins. The sun was already climbing, already hot, and it wasn't even full morning yet. Ahead she could see the endless expanse of brown land, the shimmering heat waves making the horizon waver like a mirage. Somewhere out there was Cheyenne. Somewhere out there was salvation, or at least the chance at it. But between here and there lay 200 miles of hostile country, and a deadline they couldn't afford to miss, and the weight of everything they'd left behind pressing down like the merciless sun. Evelyn touched her heels to the mare's sides, keeping pace with the herd, and tried not to think about her children waking up to find her gone. Tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong, all the dangers they were riding toward. Instead, she thought about Caleb spending his last $2 on her and her children. Thought about Dutch losing 30 years of work in 3 days and still being willing to fight. Thought about Mrs. Morrison's shotgun and the Chen family's quiet dignity and the Johnsons' weathered optimism. Thought about the fact that they were all still standing. And if they were still standing at the end of this desperate journey, if they could just hold on long enough to reach Cheyenne and sell these cattle and bring back enough money to buy themselves time, well, that would be something. That would be enough to build on. The herd moved slowly across the burning land, leaving behind a trail of dust that hung in the still air like a question mark. Behind them, empty ranches waited for their return. Ahead, an uncertain future beckoned, and in between, a group of desperate people refused to surrender to the inevitable, pushing forward into the heat and the danger and the impossible odds because the alternative was giving up. And they were all too stubborn for that. The first 3 days were hell in increments. The sun beat down without mercy, turning the air into something thick and hard to breathe. The cattle moved sluggishly, conserving what little energy they had, and twice animals simply collapsed mid-stride, too weak to continue. They had to leave them where they fell, and Evelyn tried not to think about what that meant for their chances. By the third evening, they'd covered barely 30 miles and lost 4 head. The math was brutal and getting worse. They made camp near a dry creek bed, the irony of it not lost on anyone. Dutch unhitched his wagon team while Mr. Johnson did the same, both men moving with the careful economy of those who knew they had to make their strength last. Way circled the herd, keeping them bunched, while Mrs. Morrison scouted the perimeter with her rifle ready. Evelyn helped Caleb portion out the water they'd brought, measuring each precious cupful. They'd filled every container they could find before leaving, but it still wasn't enough. The cattle needed water more than the humans did, but there wasn't enough for both. "We have to reach the spring tomorrow," Caleb said quietly, so only Evelyn could hear. "If we don't, we'll start losing animals faster than we can count them." "How far?" 10 miles, maybe 12. But it's uphill, and the cattle are already exhausted. He rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't know if they can make it." "They have to." Evelyn's voice was flat with determination. "Because if they can't, we've already lost." That night, she lay under the wagon beside Mrs. Morrison, staring up at stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The widow was quiet for a long time before speaking. "My husband built our ranch from nothing," she said softly. "Cleared the land himself, put up every fence post, birthed every calf. When the fever took him, I thought about selling, thought about going back east to my sister, living off her charity." She paused. "But then I'd see something he'd built, a gate he'd hung, a water trough he'd carved, and I couldn't do it. Couldn't let it all be for nothing." "It won't be," Evelyn said. "You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise we'll fight like hell to make sure it isn't." Mrs. Morrison laughed, a sound without humor. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Mrs. Boone. I haven't decided which." "Can it be both?" "I suppose it can." The widow shifted, adjusting her bedroll. "Your children. How old's the youngest?" "Clara's 3. You must be terrified being away from them." Evelyn thought about Clara's fever-bright eyes, the way she'd whispered, "Come back, Mama," as if she already knew how fragile promises could be. "Every minute. But I'm more terrified of what happens if we don't do this, if we let Crow win without a fight." They fell silent after that, each lost in their own fears and hopes, while around them the cattle settled for the night and the men took turns on watch. Evelyn finally drifted into uneasy sleep, dreaming of children's voices calling for her across distances she couldn't cross. She woke before dawn to the sound of cursing. Caleb was up, standing at the edge of the herd, and even in the dim pre-dawn light, Evelyn could see the rigid anger in his posture. "What's wrong?" She scrambled up, her body protesting after a night on hard ground. 3 more dead, and look, he pointed. In the dust around the cattle, Evelyn could make out boot prints, fresh ones, not matching any of their groups. Someone had been here during the night, moving among the herd. "Crow?" Mrs. Morrison said, coming up beside them. "Has to be. He knows we're out here." "How?" Dutch demanded. "We were careful. Didn't tell anyone who might—" "He's got eyes everywhere," the widow interrupted. "Ranch hands loyal to him, people who owe him money or favors. The whole territory's his web, and we're just flies in it." Caleb knelt by the dead cattle, examining them closely. "They didn't just die. Look here." He pointed to foam at one animal's mouth, the unnatural stiffness of its legs. "Poison. Someone poisoned the water we gave them last night." The words fell like stones into a still pond, rippling outward in waves of horrified understanding. If the water was poisoned, if Crow's men had gotten close enough to contaminate their supplies— "Check everything," Caleb ordered. "Every canteen, every barrel. We drink or use nothing until we know it's clean." The search was frantic and revealed the worst. 3 of their water barrels had been tampered with, the seals broken and resealed carelessly. They dumped the contaminated water onto the ground, watching their precious supply drain away into the dust. "We're down to maybe 2 days' water," Mr. Johnson said, his face grave. "And that's if we ration strict. If we don't reach the spring today, we'll reach it." Caleb's voice was hard as iron. "We move fast, we move light, and we don't stop for anything. Understood?" They broke camp within the hour, abandoning anything not absolutely essential. The mood was grim, the brief hope they'd kindled now overshadowed by the reality of active sabotage. Crow wasn't just waiting for them to fail, he was making sure they did. The climb toward the foothills began gradually, the land rising in gentle swells before steepening. The cattle balked at the incline, their weakened bodies struggling with even this modest elevation change. Evelyn rode back and forth along the flanks, pushing stragglers, her voice hoarse from calling encouragement to animals too tired to care. By midday, the heat was murderous. The sun hammered down from a sky bleached white, and the air shimmered with it. Way's horse stumbled, nearly went down, and the young man had to dismount and walk, leading the animal to spare its strength. One by one, the others followed his example until only Caleb remained mounted, ranging ahead to scout the trail. "There!" His shout came from the top of a rise. "I can see it! The spring's just beyond those rocks!" The words rippled through the group like electricity. The cattle, sensing water somehow, picked up their pace. The humans did too, exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the desperate hope of relief. But when they crested the rise and looked down into the small canyon where the spring should have been, Evelyn's heart sank. The spring was still there, water trickling from between rocks to form a small pool, but so were Harlan Crow's men. 5 of them, armed and mounted, positioned strategically around the water source. "Well, well," one of them called out. He was a big man with a scarred face and a rifle held casually across his saddle. "Looks like we got visitors, boys." Caleb rode forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. "This is open range. That's a natural spring. You've got no right to block access." "We got Mr. Crow's orders. That's all the right we need." The man grinned, showing teeth gone brown with tobacco. "He said you might try something stupid. Guess he was right." "Those cattle need water," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice shaking with fury. "You can't just—" "Can't we?" The man gestured to his companions. "Seems like we're doing it just fine." Evelyn looked at the cattle, seeing them sway with exhaustion, their tongues lolling, their eyes desperate. Looked at the spring, so close and yet impossibly far. Looked at Crow's men, 5 against their 6, but the 5 were fresh and well-armed, while their group was exhausted and outgunned. "How much?" Dutch asked suddenly. "What?" "How much did Crow pay you to sit here and watch people's livelihoods die?" "I'm just curious what a man's conscience goes for these days." The scarred man's grin faltered. "We're just doing our jobs." "Your job is murder." Evelyn's voice cut across the canyon, cold and clear. "Those cattle die. We lose everything. Our ranches, our homes, our futures. That's what you're participating in. That's what Crow's paying you to do." "That's business, lady. Nothing personal." "It's personal to me." Evelyn dismounted, her legs shaky from hours in the saddle, and walked toward the spring. "It's personal to every person here who's fighting to survive while your boss plays games with our lives." "Ma'am, I'm warning you. Warn all you want." Evelyn kept walking. "But you're going to have to shoot me to stop me from getting water for those animals. Is that what Crow's paying you for? To shoot unarmed women?" She heard Caleb call her name, heard Mrs. Morrison's sharp intake of breath, but she didn't stop. She walked steadily toward the spring, her heart hammering but her steps sure. Behind her, she heard movement, her companions following, creating a human chain moving toward the water. The scarred man raised his rifle. "I said stop." "Then shoot." Evelyn looked him dead in the eyes. "Because I'm not stopping. None of us are." The standoff stretched across seconds that felt like hours. The man's finger was on the trigger, his jaw tight. But Evelyn saw something flicker in his eyes, doubt, maybe, or the remnant of whatever conscience Dutch had mentioned. "Jackson." One of the other men spoke up, a younger one with nervous eyes. "Maybe we should just—" I mean, they're just getting water. Crow didn't say nothing about shooting folks. He said keep them away from the spring. He said slow them down. Water's not going to hurt nothing. They're already half dead as it is. Jackson looked between his men, then back at Evelyn and the determined line of people behind her. Finally, with a curse, he lowered the rifle. 10 minutes, he snarled. You get 10 minutes to water your stock. Then you clear out, or things get real unfriendly. Evelyn didn't waste time arguing. She ran the last few yards to the spring, dropping to her knees and filling her canteen with shaking hands. The others did the same, while Way and Mr. Johnson drove the cattle forward to drink. The animals surged toward the water with desperate energy, pushing and shoving to reach it. For 10 minutes, the canyon filled with the sounds of cattle drinking, humans filling containers, everyone moving with frantic efficiency. Time's up, Jackson called. Just a few more minutes, Caleb said. Not all of them have... I said time's up. Jackson raised his rifle again up. Move those cattle out now. They had no choice. They pulled the herd away from the spring, leaving behind animals still desperate for water, their own containers only half filled. As they drove the cattle up the far side of the canyon, Evelyn looked back and saw Jackson and his men settling back into position, guardians of water that should have belonged to everyone. We should have fought, Dutch said bitterly. Should have called their bluff. They weren't bluffing, Mrs. Morrison replied. Jackson's killed men before. Everyone knows it. So we just let Crow control every water source between here and Cheyenne? Let him starve us out inch by inch? We survive, Caleb said quietly. We keep moving, we stay ahead of his men, and we get these cattle to market. That's the only fight that matters now. But surviving was getting harder. That night they lost 2 more head, and in the morning another 3. The remaining cattle were skeletal, their hides stretched tight over jutting bones. The humans weren't much better, rationing water and food, pushing themselves beyond exhaustion, driven by desperation and stubbornness in equal measure. On the 7th day, they reached the edge of the foothills and looked out over rough country studded with rocks and cut through with dry ravines. Beautiful in its way, but treacherous. One wrong step could snap a leg, turn an ankle, send a wagon tumbling down a slope. We're making better time than I expected, Caleb said, studying his map. If we push hard, we might reach Cheyenne in 3 more days instead of 5. The cattle won't last 3 more days at this pace, Way said softly. It was the most he'd spoken since the journey started. Then we make them last. Caleb's voice was rough with exhaustion. Because giving up isn't an option. They pushed on, and the rough country took its toll. A wagon wheel cracked and had to be repaired with precious hours of daylight. One of the horses threw a shoe, forcing them to slow their pace. And always, in the distance, Evelyn caught glimpses of riders, Crow's men, shadowing them, waiting for their chance to strike again. On the 9th day, the attack came. They were crossing a narrow ravine, the cattle strung out in a long line, vulnerable and exposed. Evelyn was riding drag, keeping the stragglers moving, when she heard the first gunshot crack across the rocks. The cattle spooked immediately, panicking and scattering. Evelyn fought to control her mare as riders appeared on the ridgeline above them, 6 men, maybe more, firing rifles into the air to stampede the herd. Get them bunched, Caleb shouted, but it was chaos. Cattle ran in every direction, wild-eyed with fear. One of the wagons tipped, spilling supplies across the rocky ground. Way's horse reared, nearly throwing him. Evelyn saw a group of cattle breaking away, running toward a steep drop-off. Without thinking, she spurred her mare forward, cutting across their path, turning them back toward the main group. The mare responded beautifully, dancing between the panicked animals, and gradually Evelyn managed to turn the breakaway group. But the damage was done. When they finally got the herd settled and counted heads, they'd lost 12 more cattle, some to the stampede, some simply vanished into the rough country, likely never to be found. We're down to 31 head, Dutch said, his voice hollow. Not even enough to cover one ranch's debts, let alone all of ours. It's enough if we get a good price, Mrs. Morrison insisted, but even she sounded doubtful. That night, Caleb sat apart from the group, staring into the fire with eyes that had gone distant and defeated. Evelyn approached carefully, sitting down beside him without speaking. I got you into this, he finally said. You and everyone else. Convinced you we had a chance when we never did. We convinced ourselves, Evelyn replied. And we're not done yet. Look at us. We're starving, exhausted, down to 31 half-dead cattle and maybe a day's water. Crow is one. He's just letting us suffer a little longer before he finishes us off. Then we suffer. Evelyn's voice was hard. And we keep moving, because that's what we do. Why? Caleb turned to her, and in the firelight, she saw the depth of his despair. What's the point? We're going to lose anyway. The ranches, the homes, everything. Why drag it out? Evelyn thought about her children, waiting for her to come home. Thought about Samuel's 2 old eyes, and Lily's fierce determination, and Clara's fever-bright trust that Mama would fix everything. Thought about the $2 Caleb had spent when he had nothing left to give. Because giving up means Crow was right, she said. Means we were never worth fighting for in the first place. And I refuse to believe that. She paused. You spent your last $2 on me and my children. You gave us a chance when no one else would. Now I'm returning the favor. I'm giving you a chance to remember who you were before grief and drought, and Harlan Crow tried to break you. And who was that? A man who built a ranch from nothing. A man who loved hard enough to keep going even after he lost everything. A man who saw a widow standing on an auction platform and recognized strength when everyone else saw burden. Evelyn held his gaze. That man doesn't quit, so neither do we. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the restless movement of cattle. Finally, Caleb nodded, just once, but it was enough. The next morning, they pushed forward with renewed determination. The cattle were dying on their feet, the humans weren't much better, but they kept moving. Step after brutal step, mile after impossible mile, driven by nothing but will and the refusal to surrender. On the 11th day, they saw Cheyenne on the horizon. The city rose from the plains like a promise, buildings and church steeples breaking the flat line of earth and sky. Evelyn stared at it, hardly daring to believe they'd made it, that after everything, they'd actually survived the journey. We need to get them to the stockyards, Caleb said, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. Get them sold before Crow finds a way to ruin this too, Mrs. Morrison finished. Let's move. They drove the 31 remaining cattle through Cheyenne streets, drawing stares and comments from townspeople who'd seen plenty of cattle drives but probably never one this desperate-looking. The stockyards were on the east side of town, a sprawling complex of pens and auction houses. The yard manager took one look at their cattle and his expression went carefully neutral. You folks want to sell these? Yes, Caleb said. The manager walked among the animals, checking teeth, examining hooves, his face giving nothing away. They're pretty rough. Drought cattle, I'm guessing? Does it matter? Matters for price. I can give you $3 a head. Take it or leave it. $3, $93 total. Not enough to save even one ranch, let alone all of theirs. That's robbery, Dutch said. These animals are worth twice that. These animals are barely worth what I'm offering. Look at them. Half-starved, exhausted, probably won't even survive fattening up for slaughter. The manager shrugged. $3 is my final offer. Evelyn saw Caleb's shoulders slump, saw defeat wash over his face, saw Mrs. Morrison close her eyes and Dutch clench his fists uselessly. They'd come all this way, risked everything, and it still wasn't enough. But then Evelyn remembered something Harlan Crow had said, standing in her dusty yard with his cold eyes and colder smile. She remembered his arrogance, his certainty that they would fail. No, she said. Everyone turned to look at her. No? We don't accept $3 a head. These cattle are worth more, and we're not selling them for less than they deserve. Evelyn looked at the manager directly. You said they need fattening up? Fine. We'll fatten them. Give us access to one of your pens, water, and feed on credit against the eventual sale, and 2 weeks to get them in condition for a proper auction. Lady, I don't know what you think. I think you're a businessman, Evelyn interrupted. And I think you know that 2 weeks from now, these cattle could fetch $6, maybe $7 a head at proper auction. That's $186 instead of $93. You take your standard commission, everybody makes more money, or you can lowball us now for a quick sale and miss out on the bigger profit. The manager looked at her for a long moment, reassessing. Then slowly he smiled. You got steel in you, don't you? More than you know? All right, 2 weeks. But if they don't sell for what you're hoping, you take whatever price they fetch and don't complain. Deal, Evelyn said, and felt the group around her release a collective breath they'd been holding. The manager assigned them a pen and arranged for feed and water. The cattle, getting their first proper meal in over a week, began to revive almost immediately. Color returned to their eyes, strength to their movements. It was a small miracle, but it was enough. That night, in the boarding house where they'd taken rooms, Caleb knocked on Evelyn's door. I wanted to say thank you, he said when she opened it, for not giving up, for seeing a way forward when the rest of us were ready to quit. We're not through yet, Evelyn cautioned. The auction's still 2 weeks away. Crow could still find a way to sabotage us. I know, but we made it this far. He paused. That $2 I spent on you? Best investment I ever made. Evelyn smiled, feeling something warm bloom in her chest. Well then, let's make sure it pays off. The 2 weeks in Cheyenne passed in a strange suspension between hope and dread. The cattle fattened on good feed and clean water, their ribs gradually disappearing under healthier flesh, their coats taking on something resembling shine. Evelyn spent her days at the stockyards, watching over them like a mother hen, while the others took turns keeping guard and searching the city for any sign of Crow's influence. It was Mrs. Morrison who found it first. She came to Evelyn's boarding house room on the 5th day, her face tight with controlled fury. There's a lawyer in town, name's Pemberton. He works for Crow, handles all his land acquisitions and contracts. She paused, her jaw working. I got curious, did some asking around. Turns out Pemberton's been filing claims on our properties, told the Territorial Land Office we abandoned them when we left for the cattle drive. That's not possible, Evelyn said, but even as she spoke, she felt ice form in her stomach. We left people behind. Samuel's managing our place. Mrs. Chen is watching over the Morrison Ranch. They can't claim abandonment. They can if the judge signs the paperwork without checking. And Judge Hartley? Mrs. Morrison's smile was bitter. He's been in Crow's pocket for years. Everyone knows it. Nobody can prove it. Evelyn stood abruptly, her mind racing. Where's this lawyer? Pemberton? Office on 4th Street. But Evelyn, what are you... I'm going to have a conversation with him. She reached for her shawl. You coming? The lawyer's office was situated above a haberdashery accessed by a narrow staircase that smelled of dust and old paper. A brass plate beside the door read, Harold Pemberton, Esquire, Land Claims and Property Law. Evelyn knocked once, firmly, then entered without waiting for invitation. Pemberton was a thin man with thinning hair and spectacles that magnified his eyes to owlish proportions. He looked up from his desk, startled, as Evelyn and Mrs. Morrison entered. Can I help you, ladies? You can stop filing false abandonment claims on our properties, Evelyn said flatly. Something flickered across Pemberton's face. Surprise, then calculation. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? Mrs. Morrison stepped forward. The Morrison Ranch, the Boone property, the Chen family holdings. You filed abandonment claims on all of them 4 days ago. I saw the paperwork at the land office. If abandonment claims were filed, it's because the properties were in fact abandoned. It's all quite legal, I assure you. Legal isn't the same as honest, Evelyn said. Those ranches aren't abandoned. We have people maintaining them, people you know about because Crow's men have been watching our places since we left. Pemberton removed his spectacles and cleaned them with deliberate care. Mrs. Boone, is it? I've heard about you. The mail-order bride who convinced a bunch of failing ranchers to waste their last resources on a foolish cattle drive. He replaced his spectacles. Mr. Crow is simply protecting the territorial interests. When properties are abandoned, someone needs to ensure they're properly managed. For a fee, I'm sure, Mrs. Morrison said acidly. I'm a businessman. So is Mr. Crow. If you have issue with the legal proceedings, you're welcome to hire your own lawyer and contest the claims, though I doubt you can afford one, given your circumstances. Evelyn stared at the man, seeing in his smug expression everything that was wrong with the system Crow had built. A web of legal manipulation, carefully constructed to appear legitimate while crushing anyone without the resources to fight back. You're right, she said quietly. We can't afford a lawyer, but we don't need one. I beg your pardon? The Territorial Land Office keeps records, correct? Of who files claims, when they're filed, what evidence is presented. Evelyn was thinking out loud now, pieces clicking together in her mind. And there are laws about proper notification, about giving property owners time to contest claims before they're finalized. Pemberton's expression had gone wary. Standard procedure, yes. Then we'll contest, in person, at the land office, with witnesses who can testify the properties weren't abandoned. Evelyn leaned forward. And while we're there, we'll request to see all the other abandonment claims you've filed on Crow's behalf over the past 3 years. I'm curious to see if there's a pattern. The territorial authorities might be curious too. You can't. That's confidential business. Public records, Mrs. Morrison interrupted. Land claims are public records. Anyone can request to see them. Pemberton's face had gone pale. Get out of my office. Gladly. Evelyn turned toward the door, then paused. One more thing. When this auction happens and we sell our cattle for enough to pay our debts, when we contest these false claims and win, when we start asking uncomfortable questions about Crow's business practices, I want you to remember this conversation. Remember that you had a chance to do the right thing and you chose not to. They left Pemberton sputtering behind his desk and descended back to the street. Mrs. Morrison was quiet until they were well away from the building. That was either very brave or very stupid. Same thing usually, Evelyn replied. But we needed him to know we're not rolling over, and we needed to understand his strategy so we can counter it. You really think we can fight this? Crow's got judges, lawyers, probably half the territorial government in his pocket. Maybe. But he doesn't have the truth, and he doesn't have people willing to stand up and tell it. Evelyn thought about the other ranchers, the ones who'd lost everything to Crow's schemes, who'd slunk away defeated rather than fight. We need to find them. Everyone Crow's ruined over the past few years. Get their stories, their documentation. Build a case that's too big to ignore. That could take months. We don't have months. Then we work fast. Over the next week, while the cattle continued to fatten and the auction date approached, Evelyn and the others worked with focused intensity. They visited the land office, requesting records and filing formal contests to the abandonment claims. They tracked down former ranchers who'd been forced out, collecting stories and affidavits. They discovered that Crow's pattern of fraud went back 5 years and involved more than 30 properties. The evidence was damning. Loan agreements with hidden compound interest, water rights manipulated through legal technicalities, abandonment claims filed before proper notification, a systematic pattern of exploitation dressed up in legal language. But evidence alone wasn't enough. They needed someone willing to act on it. On the 12th day, Dutch came to Evelyn with news. There's a federal marshal in town. Name's William Garrett. He's here investigating some other matter, but he's got a reputation for being honest. Rare thing in these parts. Can we talk to him? We can try. Marshal Garrett was a weathered man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened to their story in his temporary office at the sheriff's station, his expression giving nothing away. When they finished, he sat back and studied them. You're asking me to investigate one of the most powerful men in 3 territories based on civil contract disputes and land claim irregularities. We're asking you to look at a pattern of fraud, Evelyn corrected. Criminal fraud, committed systematically over 5 years. Even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not saying it isn't, this falls under territorial jurisdiction, not federal. I can't just... What about the water rights? Way spoke up quietly. It was only the second time Evelyn had heard him speak in front of strangers. Some of the springs and creeks Crow controls cross federal land. If he's restricting access illegally, that's a federal matter. Garrett's eyebrows rose. Is that true? We can show you the maps, Mrs. Morrison said, and introduce you to people who can testify about being cut off from water sources they have legal right to access. The marshal considered this, his fingers drumming on the desk. All right, I'll look into it. But I'm not making any promises. If Crow's been careful, and from what you're telling me he has been, it'll be hard to make charges stick. Just look, Evelyn said. That's all we're asking. Look at the evidence with honest eyes and see what's really happening. Garrett nodded slowly. I can do that much. The auction was held on a Thursday morning, the stockyard crowded with buyers from across the territory. Evelyn stood with Caleb and the others, watching as their 31 cattle were driven into the ring. The animals looked good, not prime stock by any means, but healthy enough, sturdy enough to command decent prices. The bidding started slow but built steadily. $5 a head, then $6, then $7. Evelyn felt her heart hammering as the price climbed, hardly daring to hope. When the final gavel fell, the price had reached $7.50 per head. $232.50. It still wasn't enough to save everyone's ranches, but it was enough to buy time, to pay the most urgent debts, to keep fighting a little longer. The stockyard manager counted out their money with a satisfied smile. "Told you they'd do better with proper fattening. You folks did good work." "Thank you," Evelyn said, accepting the cash with shaking hands, "for giving us the chance." They divided the money that evening in Mrs. Morrison's boarding house room. The bills spread across the bed in neat stacks. It was decided that each ranch would get an equal share to put toward their most pressing debts, with the understanding that they'd continue to work together, to pool resources and support each other through the difficult months ahead. "It's not a solution," Dutch said, pocketing his share, "but it's a start." "It's more than we had 2 weeks ago," Caleb replied. "More than we had standing in that saloon in Redemption Springs." The mention of the saloon made Evelyn think of that day, of standing on the platform with Clara burning up in her arms, of Caleb stepping forward with his last $2. It felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been barely a month. "We should head back tomorrow," Mrs. Morrison said. "Our places have been without us long enough." "Agreed," Caleb said. "But we stay together, travel as a group, watch each other's backs. Crow's not going to like that we succeeded, and he's not going to give up just because we made one sale." They left Cheyenne the next morning, the wagons lighter without the cattle, their spirits cautiously elevated by their small victory. But the victory felt fragile, temporary, like it could shatter at any moment. The feeling proved prescient when they were still 20 miles from home. Riders appeared on the horizon, more than a dozen of them, moving fast. As they got closer, Evelyn recognized the lead rider's build, the expensive horse, the air of entitlement. Harlan Crow himself come to confront them. He pulled up his horse in front of their small caravan, his men fanning out behind him. His face was tight with controlled fury. "I underestimated you," he said without preamble. "Won't make that mistake again." "What do you want, Crow?" Caleb's hand rested on the rifle across his saddle. "What I've always wanted. What should have been mine weeks ago." Crow's eyes swept over them with contempt. "You're fighting the inevitable. Those ranches are finished. You're finished. The sooner you accept that and sell to me at reasonable prices, the less painful this has to be." "We're not selling," Evelyn said. "No?" Crow's smile was cold. "Even with abandonment claims filed against your properties? Even with debts you still can't pay? Even with a drought that shows no signs of breaking?" He leaned forward in his saddle. "You made what? $200 from that pathetic cattle sale? That won't save you. It won't save any of you." "Maybe not," Mrs. Morrison said, "but we also filed formal complaints with the Territorial Land Office, and we spoke to a federal marshal about your business practices, about the water rights you're controlling illegally, the contracts you've manipulated, the systematic fraud you've been committing for years." Something flickered across Crow's face. Surprise, then anger. "Marshal Garrett? He's got no jurisdiction over water sources that cross federal land?" "Actually, he does." Way's voice was quiet but firm. "And he's very interested in the maps we showed him." Crow's jaw tightened. "You're playing a dangerous game." "So are you," Evelyn said. "The difference is, we have nothing left to lose. You have everything. Which one of us do you think is more desperate, more willing to fight dirty?" The standoff stretched across the dusty road, tension thick enough to choke on. Evelyn watched Crow's face, saw him calculating, weighing his options. His men shifted restlessly, hands near weapons, waiting for orders. Finally, Crow spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "This isn't over." "No," Caleb agreed. "It's not. But neither are we." Crow wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following. But the threat lingered in the dust they left behind, unspoken but understood. This was far from finished. They reached Caleb's ranch just before sunset, and Evelyn's heart nearly burst when she saw her children running toward her. Samuel first trying to maintain dignity but breaking into a run at the last moment. Lily and the twins close behind, shouting with joy. And Clara held in Samuel's arms but reaching for her mother with desperate hands. Evelyn dismounted before the horse fully stopped and gathered them close, breathing in the familiar smell of them, feeling their solid warmth, their aliveness. "You're all right? Everyone's all right. We're fine, Mama," Samuel said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "We kept the garden alive, didn't lose any chickens. Clara didn't get sick again." "You did so well," Evelyn murmured. "I'm so proud of you." That night, with the children finally asleep and Caleb sitting across from her at the kitchen table, Evelyn felt the full weight of exhaustion settle over her. They'd survived the drive, made the sale, stood up to Crow, but the fight was far from over. "Marshal Garrett sent word," Caleb said quietly, sliding a telegram across the table. "He's opening a formal investigation into Crow's water rights claims. Says he found irregularities in the filing records, evidence of falsified documentation." "That's good," Evelyn said. "It's a start. But investigations take time, and Crow's got resources we don't. He can delay, obfuscate, probably buy off witnesses if he wants to. Then we stay vigilant. We keep gathering evidence, keep supporting each other, keep fighting." Evelyn looked at Caleb across the scarred wood of the table they'd shared for a month now. "That's all we can do." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, then reached across and took her hand. It was the first time he'd touched her beyond helping her on or off a horse, and the contact sent a shock through her system. "I know this isn't what you signed up for," he said. "Standing on that platform, you were looking for safety, stability. Instead, you got a failing ranch, a desperate cattle drive, and a fight against a man who wants to destroy us." "I got a chance," Evelyn corrected. "I got a man who saw worth in me and my children when everyone else saw burden. I got a home that needs me as much as I need it. I got people willing to stand together instead of falling separately." She squeezed his hand. "That's more than I had for $2. Still the best money I ever spent." Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. Over the following weeks, things began to shift. Marshal Garrett's investigation uncovered enough irregularities to freeze Crow's pending land claims pending review. The Territorial Land Office, embarrassed by the fraud happening under their noses, launched their own inquiry. Other ranchers, emboldened by the small group's success, began coming forward with their own stories of Crow's manipulation. The battle was far from won, but the tide was turning. Rain came in late September, breaking the drought with spectacular thunderstorms that turned the dry earth into mud and filled the creek beds with rushing water. The land began to recover, green shoots pushing up through brown grass, the cattle regaining weight on fresher forage. Evelyn's garden, which she'd coaxed back to life before the cattle drive, exploded with late-season vegetables. The chickens, sensing the change in weather, began laying more consistently. Small victories, but they accumulated into something that felt like hope. One evening in early October, Caleb knocked on the bedroom door frame. Evelyn looked up from where she was mending Samuel's shirt by lamplight. "Come in." He entered hesitantly, still maintaining the careful distance he'd established that first night. "I wanted to talk to you about something." "All right." "This arrangement, you sleeping in here, me in the barn, it made sense at first when we were strangers." He paused, searching for words. "We're not strangers anymore." Evelyn's heart began to beat faster. "No, we're not. I don't want to presume anything, don't want to make you uncomfortable. But if you were willing, if you thought maybe we could try being actually married instead of just legally married." He stopped, frustrated with his own awkwardness. Evelyn set down her mending and stood, crossing to where he stood in the doorway. She looked up at him, this man who'd given her everything when he had nothing, who'd fought beside her, who'd become something more than a stranger with a marriage certificate. "I think we've been actually married for a while now," she said softly. "We just haven't admitted it." "Yeah?" His voice was hopeful, uncertain. "Yeah," she smiled. "So maybe it's time you stopped sleeping in the barn." He smiled back, and it transformed his whole face, erasing years of grief and hardship. "Yeah, maybe it is." The investigation into Harlan Crow's business practices took 6 months to complete, but when it concluded, the results were damning. Federal charges for fraudulent water rights claims, Territorial charges for contract manipulation and illegal land seizures, civil suits from dozens of ranchers seeking restitution. Crow fought it all, using every legal trick and political connection he had. But the evidence was overwhelming, the testimony too consistent to dismiss. In the end, his empire crumbled, his properties seized to pay restitution, his influence shattered. The small group of ranchers who'd started it all, who'd risked everything on a desperate cattle drive and refused to give up even when all seemed lost, found themselves able to breathe again. Debts were restructured, land claims restored, water rights returned to their proper owners. It wasn't perfect. Some ranchers had lost too much to recover fully. The drought had done permanent damage that would take years to fully heal. But it was survival, hard-won and precious. A year after that day in the Redemption Springs saloon, Evelyn stood in her garden watching her children play. Clara, healthy and strong now, chased butterflies through rows of corn. The twins helped Samuel repair a fence post, working with the easy competence of children learning to be capable. Lily sat on the porch with a book, reading in the afternoon sunlight. Caleb came up behind her, his hand finding the small of her back in the familiar gesture that had become natural over the months. Good harvest this year. Best we've had, Evelyn agreed. The corn's going to be excellent, and the squash will have enough to trade with the Chen family for some of their wheat. Dutch stopped by earlier, said the cattle auction next month is looking promising. Prices are up since the drought broke. That's good. Evelyn leaned back against him, feeling his solid presence, his warmth. We're going to be all right, aren't we? Better than all right. He turned her to face him, his storm cloud eyes bright with something that looked like contentment. We're going to be good. She looked around at the ranch, the house with its new roof, the barn with its repaired walls, the garden bursting with life, the children healthy and happy. Looked at the man who'd spent $2 on her and got back more than he could have imagined. Yeah, she said softly. We really are. That night, after the children were asleep and the lamp was turned low, Evelyn lay beside her husband in their bed and thought about the journey that had brought them here. The auction platform and the desperate bid, the dying ranch and the impossible dream, the cattle drive through hell and the stubborn refusal to quit, all of it leading to this moment, this life, this family that had been built from ruins and desperation and $2 worth of hope. Outside, the wind moved through healthy grass, carrying the scent of rain and growing things. The cattle lowed softly in the pasture, content. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The sounds of a living land, a working ranch, a future that had almost slipped away but hadn't, because a group of desperate people had refused to let it. Evelyn closed her eyes and let herself drift toward sleep. Caleb's breathing steady beside her, the weight of his arm across her waist, a comfort and a promise. They'd survived. More than that, they'd won. Not perfectly, not without scars, but definitively. They'd stood when the world expected them to fall. They'd fought when surrender would have been easier. They'd built something real from nothing but determination and the slimmest thread of possibility. And in the end, that had been enough. The $2 bride had bought back her future, one hard day at a time, had found not just survival, but belonging, not just shelter, but home, not just a legal arrangement, but love that grew slowly in the spaces between shared hardship and hard-won victory. In the morning, there would be work to do, gardens to tend, cattle to manage, children to raise, a ranch to build into something permanent and good. But tonight, wrapped in the peace of accomplishment and the warmth of her husband's embrace, Evelyn allowed herself simply to rest, to be grateful for the journey that had brought her here, to be hopeful for the future that stretched ahead, to be content with the life she'd claimed for herself and her children with nothing but courage and $2 worth of chance. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.